Welcome to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy, the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, discussions, conferences, and other initiatives to explore issues of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can learn more and watch videos of our lectures online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. And for your friends who were unfortunate enough to have missed today's lecture, you can tell them that in a couple days this one will be online as well. I'm really pleased to welcome an expert on global peace building and reconciliation to speak to us about the culture war over Islam and the role of religious freedom in moving things forward. Daniel Philpott is professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Between 2000 and 2006, he traveled regularly to Kashmir, the disputed Indian territory that's recently been in the news, as a senior associate for the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. From 2009 to 2013, he shifted his focus to Africa, helping leaders in the Catholic Church develop a vision of reconciliation in the Great Lakes region, the East Africa. As director of the Center of Civil and Human Rights in at Notre Dame, he directed research on the role of forgiveness in peace building in Uganda. He's published a number of books on reconciliation, religion, and global politics, including The Politics of Past Evil, Religion, Reconciliation, and Transitional Justice in 2006, God's Century, Resurgent Religion in Global Politics in 2011, Just and Unjust Peace, An Ethic of Political Reconciliation in 2012, and Restorative Justice, Reconciliation and Peace Building in 2014. Religious freedom is a major theme in Professor Philpott's work. He's co-director of the Under Caesar's Sword Project, which researches Christian responses to persecution around the globe and is funded by the Templeton Religious Trust. Since 2011, he's been an associate scholar at what is now the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. And his most recent book, which he'll share more about today, is Religious Freedom in Islam, The Fate of a Universal Human Right in the Muslim World Today. His talk is one of the Deichmann Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity, a distinguished series at the McFarland Center made possible through the generosity of the John Deichmann family, class of '73. It's also part of International Education Week, which we are celebrating here at Holy Cross. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Philpott.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introduction, Tom. And it's a great honor to be giving this lecture. I'm grateful to the Deichmann family for their generosity and for the McFarland Center for the kind invitation. So the Islam question is the subject of a culture war that has been roiling in the West over Islam. It has played out again and again on cable news, talk radio, the internet, and in newspapers, at least as far back as the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And indeed, every time Islam appears in some way to be linked with violence. Consider the murder of the Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, Al-Qaeda's bombings in Madrid and London, Danish cartoons mocking the Prophet Muhammad, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Regensburg Address of Pope Benedict XVI, the building of an Islamic community center in Lower Manhattan, the Arab uprisings of 2011, shootings at Fort Hood in San Bernardino, the predations of Boko Haram and the Islamic State, and so forth. There are hawks and there are doves. Hawks hold that violence and intolerance are widespread in Islam, that Islam is hardwired for these pathologies through its text and doctrines, that Islam is inhospitable to liberal democracy, and then the prescription comes that the West must gird up for a long struggle against the Islamic threat. Doves hold that Islam is pluralistic and diverse. Like all religions, Islam has extremists, but they are few. Where violence and intolerance do exist in Islam, it feeds off local and historical particular circumstances. It's not hardwired. Islam is capable of democracy. The West should acknowledge its own role in contributing to violence in Islam and engage in a dialogue that can increase the sphere of shared understanding. Are more nuanced views available? Of course there are, and my aim, in fact, is to present one. Yet it is remarkable to me how widely the debate follows these lines, not only on cable news and the like, but also in higher brow publications like the New Republic, the National Review, the New York Review of Books, and yes, in universities. I believe that scholars have a responsibility to shed light on public controversies, and this is the aim of my remarks, which are drawn from my recently published book, Religious Freedom in Islam, Intervening in a Culture War. I wish to take a close look at Islam with respect to claims that it is either a violent or a peaceful religion, oppressive towards outsiders and dissenters, or tolerant. The same question can be fruitfully posed towards any religion, or for that matter, secular ideologies, or states and other communities. But I want to ask the question with regard to Islam because it is so contentious in our political conversation and because there are important stakes in it. It matters for the foreign policy of the United States and other Western states, and for the larger set of cultural attitudes that vitally shape relations between the West and the Islamic world, including Muslims living in the West. And I want to pose as a criterion for getting at this question the principle of religious freedom. Why religious freedom? Many scholars have proposed democracy as the criterion and assessed Islam's compatibility. Democracies, elections and popular rule, though, coexist perfectly well with intolerance towards religious minorities and dissenters, the tyranny of the majority. Religious freedom adds human rights to rule by the demos. Others have invoked tolerance as the criterion. But tolerance is temporary, like a truce, and is not founded on a deep principled basis. Religious freedom, by contrast, is principled and permanent. When a community adopts religious freedom, its members agree enduringly to respect the full citizenship rights of those with whom they disagree over the ultimate questions. Today, some critics of religious freedom argue that the standard is a Western one and should not be imposed on the rest of the world. I have argued, by contrast, and argue in the book at greater length, that religious freedom is a universal human right, consonant with its appearance in the major international conventions. Is Islam hospitable to religious freedom, then? Different methods for answering the question might be adopted. Islam's founding texts, the Quran and the Hadith, could be examined. The tradition of Islamic thought could be plumbed. Or we might look at Islam as a whole, at the Muslim world as a whole, around the globe, noting, for instance, the rise in Islamic terrorism since 1980. My method is to look at the Muslim world through the 47 or so Muslim majority states. Now, an excellent index for assessing religious freedom has been developed by Pew Research Center scholars Brian J. Grimm and Roger Finke. Their Government Restriction Index scores the laws and policies of 198 states and territories on a scale of 0, which is the least free, to 10, which are the most free, based on a battery of 20 questions that measure particular dimensions of religious freedom. Based on these scores, Pew divides the world's countries into 4 categories of restrictiveness: very high, high, moderate, and low. What do the numbers tell us about religious freedom in Islam? From a satellite view, the picture seems to favor the more hawkish perspective. Of 47 Muslim-majority states, 36, more than 3/4, have high restrictions on religious freedom. Taken as a whole, the set of Muslim-majority states is far less religiously free than the global average, or the set of Christian-majority countries, for instance. Zooming in from a landscape view to a close-up view, however, the picture starts to look more diverse and hopeful. It becomes apparent, for instance, that 11 out of 47, or nearly 1/4 regimes of Muslim-majority countries, have low restrictions on religious freedom, according to the Pew Index, and can thus be judged religiously free. Among the regimes that exhibit high levels of religious restriction, Pew's moderate, high, and very high categories, there is diversity in the reasons behind the restrictions. To understand this diversity, we must look beyond the numbers to the manner in which religious freedom is restricted. Crucial is what we may call a regime's political theology. That is, the doctrine of political authority, justice, and the proper relationship between religion and state that political and religious actors derive from more foundational theological and philosophical claims. Among religiously unfree regimes in Muslim-majority countries, two very different political theologies can be found. One is secular repressive, where the state marginalizes Islam in order to build a modern society. 15 regimes fit this description. The other is religiously repressive, characterized by an Islamist political theology, where the state imposes a strongly traditional form of Islam. 21 regimes fit this description. When regimes with a religiously free political theology are added to these orientations, a typology of three kinds of regimes in Muslim-majority states emerges. Let us take a closer look at the three orientations. Consider first the 11 religiously free regimes in the Muslim-majority world. Their governments are committed in principle to refraining from coercing or discriminating heavily against individuals and religious communities in their practice of religion. They adhere closely to international human rights conventions in matters of religion. Their constitutions either do not mention Islam or else mention it in a sense that has little implication for the interpretation of law. Their constitutions also contain robust provisions for religious freedom, allowing religious people and communities wide liberty to practice and express their faith, to educate their children in their faith, and to govern their communities and their properties. They protect the liberty of Muslims who dissent from prevailing orthodoxies and of religious minorities such as Christians, Jews, and Baha'is. In these states, Muslim religious leaders promote the vigorous practice of Islam, the spread of Islam, and a robust Islamic culture, while often enjoying direct support for religious activities. These are the implications of a political theology of religious freedom. In a certain sense, religiously free states are secular, but this requires a clarification of the fraught and protean word secular. Pope Benedict XVI distinguishes between positive secularism, which involves a healthy separation of religion and state and robust religious freedom, with negative secularism, where the state, motivated by an anti-religious ideology, seeks to restrict, marginalize, and privatize religion. Religiously free states are secular in the positive sense. The greatest concentration of religiously free Muslim-majority countries is in West Africa, where they are found in Senegal, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. Lebanon is another interesting case. There's also Djibouti, Kosovo, and Albania. But let's focus on West Africa. Most of the West African countries contain minorities of Christians and other faiths, and many of them Shia and Ahmadi communities who descend from mainstream Sunni Islam. This is the geographic heart of religiously free Islam and offers the strongest existing evidence for the possibility of religious freedom in the Muslim world. Importantly, these countries are free not despite or apart from, but rather because of their Islamic character. Prevalent in them is Sufi Islam, which strongly stresses the free character of faith and the presence of God in every person. Sufis often appeal to Quran 2:256, which says there is no compulsion in religion. I'll come back to that a little later. They refrain from labeling anyone an apostate and even defend a right to exit Islam. Dating back to the 14th and 15th centuries in West Africa, Sufism is arguably the most important shaper of the region's unusual degree of interreligious harmony and tolerance, and more broadly, the commitments to freedom in matters of faith that form the political theology that underlies governance in these regions. One might also look at the manner in which Islam came to the region back in the 15th and 16th centuries. Unlike, say, in the Middle East, where it was spread by conquest in the generations just after the Prophet Muhammad, Here it came through small bands of missionaries and traders who had to make accommodations with the surrounding rulers and the surrounding religion. That pattern of accommodation helped to set the long pattern for interreligious harmony and religious freedom. Within the last 5 years, Islamist groups, some of them Salafi, have grown in most of these countries, often influenced from the outside, and in some cases committing violence and terrorism. All of these countries, though, despite this, have maintained their high levels of religious freedom. The second orientation of Muslim-majority states towards the governance of religion is based on a political theology of secular repression. The political theology of secular repression runs something like this. We are a modern nation that is headed for greatness. We will develop a modern economy, and everyone, yes, everyone, boy or girl, regardless of caste or class, will receive an education. We will advance in science, technology, and military might. European states have shown us the path to the future, but they will no longer be our masters or colonizers. This progress requires keeping religion in check. So goes the logic. Our citizens may practice religion if it gives meaning to their lives and makes them more virtuous, but religion will not define our public life. Religion is irrational, superstitious, and the source of hierarchies that impede equality, and it directs people's pursuits away from this world and its endeavors, and their loyalties away from the state. Perhaps religion can become more serviceable to the public weal, but it must be reformed and modernized, and this will require oversight and governance, even heavy-handed oversight and governance. Typically, Islamic secular repressive rulers will establish a moderate version of Islam by supporting it, commending it, and closely controlling the governance of mosques, seminaries, universities, and schools, the content of curricula, the public expression of religion, the architecture of buildings, and even the dress of their children and citizens. They will simultaneously suppress more traditional and radical forms of Islam, preventing its clerics from holding positions of power, and if necessary, jailing them, torturing them, or killing them. Secular leaders will present these religious figures as enemies of the state and use them to make the case for authoritarian rule. It's me or the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt's Hosni Mubarak would say to his critics. The prototype of this pattern in the Muslim world is the Republic of Turkey, founded by Kemal Ataturk in 1923. After World War II, several Arab states adopted the model, the most influential of these being Egypt, but they also included Libya, Morocco, Jordan, Syria, and Algeria. Iran embodied the pattern under the Shahs of the Pahlavi dynasty up until the Shah's overthrow in 1979, as did Iraq under Saddam Hussein up until his overthrow in 2003. Indonesia was a secular repressive state under the dictatorship of Suharto from 1967 to 1998. Still secular repressive are the Soviet republics of Central Asia, including Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Azerbaijan. The third orientation is a religiously repressive one based on a political theology of Islamism, which calls for the government to use law and policy to promote a traditional form of Islam in all spheres of life: the family, the economy, culture, religious practice, education, dress, and other areas. Islamism originated in the first half of the 20th century in the thought of intellectuals like Hassan al-Banna, Abu Allah al-Maududi, and Sayyid Qutb, who called for a revival of Islam in the wake of centuries of decline due to internal moral decay and external imperial domination, symbolized most vividly by the abolition of the caliphate by the newly established Republic of Turkey. Religiously repressive regimes contain strong constitutional provisions that establish Islam as the identity of the state and the source of law. They exercise strong authority in both supporting and regulating the Muslim religious community and their state, while sharply restricting dissenting forms of Islam and religious minorities. There are 21 of these regimes. The standard bearers are Saudi Arabia and Iran, who seek to spread Islamism far beyond their borders. Sudan and Afghanistan are strong examples too. While most of these regimes are highly authoritarian, some of them are democracies whose electoral dynamics favor religiously repressive policies, including Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Indonesia. Indonesia might at first seem like a strange choice to include in this category because it is the world's largest democracy, has two large movements that espouse tolerance, the world's largest Muslim democracy, has two large movements that espouse tolerance, and has a regime based on Pancasila, which recognizes 7 official religions. At the same time, however, there are numerous ways in which Indonesia's laws and government restrict minority religions, especially those not officially recognized, and in which the Indonesian state empowers Islamist groups in society. For these reasons, Indonesia ranks in Pew's very high level of restrictions on religious freedom. What does this typology of 3 regimes teach us about religious freedom in Islam? The principle that I have proposed is a criterion for our present culture war. It shows that while there is a dearth of religious freedom in Islam, the Hawk's point, Islam is not straightforwardly responsible for the dearth, as the Doves would have it. While Islamist regimes make the strongest case for the Hawk's view, even they are a product of modern times, formed through an alliance with a sovereign state, in many cases incubated in secular repression, and erected partly in reaction to colonialism, and not merely an outgrowth of the Quran. Behind secular repressive regimes are principles imported from the West. Religiously free regimes, almost 1/4 of Muslim-majority regimes, are more than anomalies and show that religious freedom is possible and that religious repression is not the overwhelming story of contemporary Islam. I may have mentioned that the benchmark I have been using to assess religious freedom is the scores of the Pew Forum for 2009. I chose this date because it allows us to survey the landscape of Islam prior to the rapid changes sparked by the Arab uprisings. I wish now to say a few words about the Arab uprisings that began at the end of 2010 in Tunisia with a frustrated fruit vendor's self-immolation. What do they teach about Islam and religious freedom? 5 years after the protest of early 2011, almost all these predominantly Muslim countries were not more religiously free. So the countries in which the major uprisings occurred that were sparked by the Arab uprisings generally were not more religiously free and still are not today, 8 years later. The dreams of the courageous people who first took to the streets, risking being trampled by the forces of a dictatorship, were largely dashed as well. In the 6 countries where uprisings took place, the uprisings succeeded in 4: Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, and failed in 2: Syria, where there's still a civil war going on, and Bahrain. In all but one of these cases, Tunisia, democracy failed to advance. Islamic countries, along with a vast failure of religious freedom and democracy, does such a correlation bolster the judgment that Islam is inhospitable to religious freedom? Here again, zooming in on the cases reveals a more complex picture. Hawks can explain part of this picture insofar as traditional Islamic forces, radical jihadi militant groups, Salafist and Islamist in general, obstructed freedom's emergence. To leave matters there, though, leaves a great deal unexplained. The secular repressive dictatorships that ruled Arab countries for decades bear much of the blame for the failure of religiously free democracy to advance. Decades of secular repression in Egypt, Libya, and Syria suppressed Islamic parties inclined towards democracy or religious freedom and drove some Muslims into violent or obstructive reaction. And when regimes in Egypt and Libya fell, left a gargantuan task of governance to parties with little political experience. In Syria, a secular repressive regime persists, and foments mutual antagonism with the religiously repressive groups who dominate the rebellion. The fate of freedom in the Arab uprisings is explained further, following the argument of the book, by the presence of Islamic proponents of religious freedom. Tunisia's Ennahda party is the best example of such a party, one that had developed a commitment to democracy and religious freedom prior to the uprisings, was willing to enter into coalition with secular parties, worked to open up the system for religious participation in the wake of brutal secular repression, and was willing to stand down when it lost the elections of fall 2014. Though Tunisia's Pew numbers show a slight decline in religious freedom by 2013, I believe that religious freedom opened up more than the numbers show, though this is still compromised in significant ways. In each of the countries where major uprisings took place, there were also people and factions who stood for religious freedom on Islamic grounds. Indeed, I would argue that where parties or factions holding a political theology of religious freedom were relatively strong, democracy stood a much better chance. And where forces of secular repression and religious repression were relatively strong, democracy was handicapped. Religion matters, and religious freedom matters. So this brings us to the question, now that we've seen a kind of landscape of religious freedom in the Muslim majority world, and kind of close up on the Arab uprisings, we can stand back a little bit and ask, is there hope for increasing religious freedom in the Muslim world? One often reads in the Western media that what Islam needs is a reformation. In another version, it is an enlightenment that Islam really needs. In either rendering, Western history is invoked to reveal a pathway for Islam. The West, too, once knew a time when intolerance reigned, the logic runs. But then a revolution took place that ushered in freedom. Should Islam experience a similar revolution, it too would realize freedom. Now, Muslims will not likely find these pathways to be promising. The Protestant Reformation divided Christendom, bred religious war, and took a century and a half to produce a cluster of religious freedom champions who remained a minority among Protestants. The Enlightenment was decidedly mixed in its support for religious freedom and yielded the harsh secularism of the French Revolution and its Republican legatees in Europe and Latin America. Muslims have experienced the European Enlightenment directly on their own turf. Enlightenment ideas have inspired what I have called the secular repressive model of regime. Some of them, like Egypt and Syria, are torture capitals of the world. Should Westerners then abstain altogether from commending their own history as a pathway for Muslims? Well, I believe that Western history does in fact contain a pathway to freedom that is promising for Islam. Ironically, it can be found in the religious body that the Reformation and the Enlightenment both considered freedom's greatest enemy, the Catholic Church. It can hardly escape notice that the Catholic Church came around to religious freedom quite late in history. Upon the Second Vatican Council's promulgation of Dignitatis Humanae, its declaration on religious liberty in 1965, 3 centuries after certain Protestant and Enlightenment voices began to articulate religious liberty. The Church's long historical pathway to Dignitatis Humanae, however, can prove instructive for Islam. In some respects, the Catholic Church's experience will not apply to Islam. For instance, Islam does not contain a single locus of authority that speaks for all Muslims in the way that the Catholic Church does through its pope, its bishops, and its theology of the church as one body. This difference, though, leaves intact the sense in which Dignitatis Humanae is directly relevant for Islam, namely, that it shows how a religious body that for many centuries did not teach religious freedom eventually found a way to embrace religious freedom that was compatible with its traditional teachings about religious faith. None other than Pope Francis drew from this tradition when he became the first pope to visit the Arabian Peninsula this past spring. There, he invoked his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi, who, near the end of his life, journeyed to Egypt to convert the Muslim sultan to Christianity and ended up engaging with him in a dialogue about peace. In his dialogue with Muslims in the United Arab Emirates, our latter-day Francis raised the issue that most mars peace between Catholics and Muslims, religious freedom. Tu quoque, Pope Francis's interlocutors might well have pointed out that St. Francis encountered the Sultan on the front lines of the Wars of the Crusades, not one of the Church's sparkling episodes of religious freedom, or that 15th and 16th century Catholic Spain expelled Muslims and Jews, who then found refuge under a different sultan in the far more tolerant Ottoman Empire, or that the Church conducted inquisitions over the course of 6 centuries, and that Catholics fought a century and a half of religious wars with Protestants. While the Muslim world's dearth of religious freedom demands honesty, the Catholic Church's history forbids triumphalism, but might even offer Muslims a pathway to the future. During the 15th through 20th centuries, when the Church was losing its grip on its medieval temporal power, it feared religious freedom, much as many Muslims do today. Its rivals were Protestant reformers, Enlightenment intellectuals, and their political agents, who portrayed the Church as a purveyor of dungeons, superstition, and hierarchy, and whose version of religious freedom sent Catholics into hiding or to the guillotine. In reaction, 19th century popes thundered against religious freedom, including Gregory XVI, who called liberty of conscience an absurd and erroneous proposition in 1832, and Pius IX, who condemned religious freedom in his Syllabus of Errors in 1864. The Church hierarchy's political thesis was that states would establish the Catholic Church and restrain other faiths, while the Church acquiesced to non-establishment and religious freedom only on the hypothesis that Catholics were in a minority. It was called the thesis hypothesis doctrine. The established Catholic Church was ideal, but we would take religious freedom and non-establishment if necessary. Now, eventually, the Church found its way to a deep principled articulation of religious freedom, which again it proclaimed in its landmark declaration, Dignitatis Humanae, at the close of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. Animated by this teaching and by the Second Vatican Council's more general endorsement of human rights, Catholic churches then came to challenge dictators and champion democracy over ensuing decades in Poland, the Philippines, Chile, South Korea, Ukraine, Malawi, and many other countries. How did the Catholic Church travel from fearing freedom to fomenting freedom? Not by adopting the logics of its rivals, but rather by developing a new teaching from its own history and tradition. It looked back to the early centuries of the Church, when church fathers like Tertullian and Lactantius argued for religious freedom for all people living under the Roman Empire. While Augustine and Aquinas, 2 of the Church's greatest theologians, defended the coercion of heretics by the state, both also stressed the free character of faith, a central component of Dignitatis Humanae. The Church's favorable experience under constitutions of religious freedom in the United States and in post-World War II Western Europe taught it that living under a constitution that provides genuine religious freedom need not be a threat. 20th century intellectuals such as Jacques Maritain, Heinrich Rahmann, and John Courtney Murray developed arguments for religious freedom that retrieved favorable doctrines from the tradition and set them in the context of modern constitutional democracy. While opponents of religious freedom at the Second Vatican Council objected that error has no rights, proponents rejoined, yes, but people do. By tying religious freedom to human dignity, the Council Fathers untied it from the religious relativism and secularism that caused earlier popes to reject it. Like yesterday's Catholics, today's Muslims widely fear religious freedom, perceiving it as a Western export that is packaged with individualism, the breakdown of the family, secularism, and the efforts of Christian missionaries to convert them. Yet, Muslims may find in their own history and tradition grounds for embracing religious freedom, much as the Catholic Church did. The Quran, as I said earlier, contains one of the strongest statements of freedom in the text of any religious tradition. There is no compulsion in religion, a verse that proponents of religious freedom have put forth throughout the tradition. The Prophet Muhammad, though he was a conqueror, established tolerance towards non-Muslims, including Jews, in the Constitution of Medina, and never punished anyone per se for leaving the faith. Muslim countries and regions that were religiously tolerant can be found in medieval Spain, 19th century Ottoman Empire, and early 20th century Iran, Egypt, and Central Asia. Again, today, 11 Muslim-majority countries, nearly one-fourth of the total, are religiously free. These are what I call seeds of freedom that could be drawn upon, and if they were nurtured and germinated and helped to grow and expand, could be the basis for a much wider, expanded, practice and doctrine of religious freedom within the Muslim world. The West can also do its part to promote religious freedom. One of the best ways it can do this is to stress the universality of religious freedom as a universal human right. In 1998, the U.S. Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act. More recently, the European Union, Canada, the United Kingdom, Austria, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Norway have adopted religious freedom into their foreign policies in one way or another. Canada reversed course, though, closing its Office of Religious Freedom in March 2016. Religious freedom is a universal human right. The credibility and effectiveness of policies to realize religious freedom in the Muslim world everywhere depend on these policies being shared in a way that reflects this universality. The best way to ensconce religious freedom in the common conscience of humankind, rather than allow it to become one side of a culture war, is to expand the network of people and organizations who share a stake in it. Religious freedom cannot only be the cause of the U.S. and other Western governments. In the book, I propose a transnational network of religious freedom constituencies, including civil society organizations in countries where religious freedom might be expanded, organizations in free countries that promote religious freedom, international organizations, Western governments, and religious bodies. Working together, the members of such a constituency would strengthen one another and pressure unfree regimes from all sides. Historically, international communism operated on this principle, with its international network of parties and local cell groups. Premised upon a bad idea, it was not successful. More can be hoped for religious freedom. Now, interestingly, you looked at the Trump administration, who I would be reluctant to mention in terms of promoting harmony with Islam. Certainly, President Trump's own many statements and tweets and so forth towards Islam have been anything but promoting of harmony and are not to be admired. And yet, under the State Department, perhaps more under the initiative of the Secretary of State, over the last 2 summers, the U.S. government has hosted something called a ministerial. And in the past one, you had governments of some 106 countries and over 1,000 civil society and religious leaders gathering to talk about and make a common commitment to religious freedom. One of the architects is an ambassador for religious minorities, not ambassador, special assistant in the State Department, a gentleman named Knox Timms, who was appointed by the Obama administration, stayed on in the Trump administration, and really, I think, has been the key guy to promote this. And his vision is precisely this kind of transnational network of people committed to religious freedom that can expand it in places where, it is not non-existent. It had a bipartisan feel to it. Nancy Pelosi addressed the group And I think it is a good example of a kind of international effort where the United States is acting in a highly multilateral way to promote a universal principle in a way that I think could very much bear fruit. The best way to realize religious freedom is to expand the sphere of people who are persuaded by the principle. The more people around the world who undergo a gestalt shift towards perceiving religious freedom as a universal human right, the stronger and wider the political demand for change will be. New possibilities for global cooperation will emerge as well. Religious freedom is a norm of peace. It is a principled commitment, not just a pragmatic accommodation, and is a commitment not simply to coexist, but also to respect the full and equal citizenship rights of the people who hold and live out divergent answers to the most important questions about human existence. Religious freedom is a norm of reconciliation. With respect to the public debate that rages in the West, it is a criterion that reveals both hawks and doves to be both right and wrong, and that, were both sides willing to acknowledge what is right in the other side's position, could do much to calm the dispute. With respect to the West and the Muslim world, religious freedom summons a new set of relationships that are different from those of many centuries past, when both sides failed to treat the members of the other side as equals in their most ultimate commitments, and far worse. The ability to choose this new history and to prove false the inevitability prescribed by the past is another dimension of freedom not to be overlooked. Thank you. Well, I think you're right that religious freedom is something that goes further than tolerance, which is kind of a modus vivendi or just a kind of accommodation to the reality of pluralism in a way that says, let's just live with each other. Religious freedom, calls for a kind of principled respect for the full citizenship rights and freedom to practice religion within a very broad remit of every religious community and every individual. And so I think there's a important principle of justice there to be maintained. But in terms of how Muslim countries and communities and so forth might develop it, here is where I would point to what I call the seeds of freedom, which are elements in the tradition itself that I think voice religious freedom or voice different parts of it or voice important piece of it or illustrate parts of it that could be nurtured and developed in a way that is authentic within the tradition. I think that's the important thing that I want to get from the Catholic example, is that in the Catholic tradition, they look back to principles that were in the tradition, right? And were able to draw upon those, including early expressions of religious freedom, and then draw upon those and then kind of articulate this doctrine, whereas they were being pressured also by outside ideas like the Enlightenment and so forth to do this, but ultimately they came to do it on their own basis. But nevertheless, it's very true, though, that there was a dialogue with the modern world that kind of brought this about. And yet, so it was certainly true with that dialogue where it was kind of challenged and modeled and so forth, but ultimately it came to embrace it on principles that came authentically from the tradition. And so are there kind of bases for that to be done in Islam? Well, I would say the Quranic verse, there is no compulsion in religion, is very important. And in fact, it's not just something that's kind of pulled out, but has in fact been understood by proponents of religious freedom or something very much like it in the tradition as the kind of key teaching, right? So it's not just that, I found this one verse, hey, that looks good. No, it has a tradition there behind it. I think there are elements in the life of the prophet that illustrate the tradition. That's obviously very important for Muslims. I think there are episodes in the history of Islam, medieval Spain, in certain senses the Ottoman Empire, 19th century Iran and Egypt, and places where you have, in today, Western Africa, that illustrate that in practice, religious freedom can be done. One of the interesting things about Western Africa is that Pew surveys also show that it's one of the most religious parts of the world. So some skeptics say, well, it's only when you become more secular that you really can develop religious freedom. It's only those secular people, they have to stop being religious. But Western Africa is one of the most devout, robustly religious parts of the world, and yet they have religious freedom. And so I think that's a good example that you can say to other Muslims, you don't have to stop becoming religious. In fact, this helps you to practice your religion. It gives you the space for it to be done most robustly. And I think that's what happened in the Catholic Church, a combination of doctrinal bases, but also kind of lived historical experience led many to say, hey, this is something that actually is part of who we are, not against who we are. And that's the kind of thing that I think could hold potential for Islam. Yeah. Yes?
Have you, for comparison's sake, ever looked at how Catholic countries are oppressive?
Are repressive?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think you've got, there's the long history of when the kind of Catholic Church was, sanctioning what looked like, what is not religious freedom, different forms of religious coercion. There's, the long history of Inquisition and crusades and the religious wars, where the thinking was really that the political realm had to be a realm of uniform religion, that if you didn't have that, then that was that would really break apart the society. And that people who, someone who was a heretic, the idea wasn't so much that you could coerce the heretic back into faith, but rather it was that person was sort of damaging the public peace and endangering other people's, faith. So the heretic was almost something like someone guilty of sedition, like a rebel, right? Because the ideology was that the realm had to be one of religious uniformity. So that was the model for many years. And, then coercion could be used against people who were of a different faith and so forth. And, up to even after the Second Vatican Council, there were still some countries where that was the case. Like think of Spain under Franco. But I think that the force of the council itself had a lot to do, this is what I would argue, at actually helping to overthrow Franco and bring democracy. So, but yeah, pretty late into the game, if we're talking about repressing, if we're talking about like religious repression, the lack of religious freedom, pretty late in the game, that was still, prevalent, but certainly still existed in Catholic majority populations. Religious freedom in the Western countries has had an interesting trajectory. And, many people kind of commonly believe that in the Enlightenment, so the 18th century, that was kind of the breakthrough of religious freedom. And, there is some truth to that. There were some Enlightenment thinkers who did advance religious freedom, thinking like some of the American founders, for instance. But I think it's vastly overrated. John Locke is often thought of as a key kind of development. And sure, his letter on toleration was important for religious freedom historically. I have questions about whether his arguments were really very strong ones. And he would curtail it for atheists, Muslims who were loyal to the Sultan, and Catholics. Although I just saw about a month ago, I think they discovered a new document of Locke that showed actually that he was more sympathetic to freedom for Catholics. So maybe the jury's out a little bit there. But other Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Diderot and so forth were not very. Rousseau talked about establishing a civil religion and put the death penalty on it if you didn't hold it. So he thought you needed a religion to sort of keep civic peace, but it couldn't be the Christian religion or the Catholic religion, So, and that kind of set the stage for the French Revolution, which, in some ways advanced principles of civil liberties and things that we now think of as part of constitutional democracy, but in other ways could be quite repressive and was broadly repressive towards Catholics, forcing them to declare an oath by which they were loyal to the regime and not to the Pope, and many Catholics were killed or imprisoned and so forth. So, and then that produced a kind of legacy of republicanism that often had a kind of strongly anti-Catholic character to it. Third Republic of France, 1870 to 1940, I guess, was very anti-clerical. Thousands of Catholic schools were shut down. Jesuits were expelled, and we can all appreciate that here at Holy Cross. Over in Germany, they had the Kulturkampf of Bismarck, also expelling Catholics and imprisoning them and expelling Jesuits. Early 20th century Mexico was quite anti-clerical. Then you go into the 20th century and you have communism and fascism developing, and not very good on religious freedom. So pretty far into the history, it's pretty problematic to just say the West was the place where religious freedom happened. It's really after World War II that, at least in Western Europe, you had the kind of consolidation of religious freedom in Western democracies like Germany and France, and England was pretty good by then. And it was kind of in that atmosphere in Italy, and it was kind of in that atmosphere that then the Catholic Church at the Second Vatican Council said, well, maybe there are some realms here where maybe we could do okay under a regime of religious freedom. Maybe religious freedom doesn't have to be something that involves repression of Catholics. And the presence of those democracies helped to demonstrate that. I also think the example of the United States was very important, because here's a place where the Catholic Church, on balance, did pretty well. Develop schools and universities and hospitals and churches and parishes, and yet it did so under a constitution of religious freedom and non-establishment. Well, that kind of jammed the circuits of the folks at the Vatican, because that wasn't supposed to happen. The church was supposed to be at a place where it was established. But the fact that it could actually do pretty well in an environment of religious freedom, I think was also instructive and helped to bring about the changes of the Second Vatican Council. But in general, I would be highly cautious about just equating the West with religious freedom. It's much more of a mixed bag historically than that image suggests. Yeah. You have countries, the 21 countries that I called religiously repressive, would be ones where the state gets behind kind of Sharia law, a very traditional form of Sharia law, and promotes it in a way that is, pretty heavy-handed, and then doesn't leave a lot of room for dissent or for religious minorities and so forth. And, I don't know, whether you ask me if I'm optimistic, I'm not sure. It's very hard to predict exactly where it's going. My main point was that I think in the Muslim world there are a lot of potentialities for freedom, but whether one should be optimistic about those developing, I'm not sure. Indonesia is an interesting example, because it had a democratic revolution in '98 and overthrew the kind of what I call the secular repressive government of Suharto. But since then, democracy has actually kind of allowed a more repressive form of Islam to develop, as it has over 20 years. And democracy doesn't necessarily help the picture either. So, I'm not sure where it's going, but there is still a large part of the Muslim world that is still in this kind of religiously repressive category. Well, that's where I think this idea of a kind of transnational network might be something that's promising. You look at something like Indonesia, it has a lot of problems with religious repression, but it's also, in many ways, an open democracy. And there can be civil conversation, and you have two major parties and movements who are pretty favorable towards at least a heavy degree of tolerance. And so there's a lot of room for, in places like that, at least there's a lot of room for contestation and conversation and that sort of thing. Not that it can't be dangerous. Or I think of somewhere like Pakistan, again, big problems. They have the blasphemy laws, and we read about some of the people jailed under those laws and so forth. But you can still write an article in the newspaper and that sort of thing and advocate for religious freedom. Now, you might be taking your life into your hands vis-a-vis certain groups, but, so in places where there's a relatively open conversation, at least, democratic debate and maybe evolution of ideas can take place. Much harder to do in, a place like Saudi Arabia, where, it's much more repressive. There's a lot less of it. Yeah. So But I also think you can put together networks of Muslim intellectuals who are favorable toward this. In the last 7 or 8 years, there have been 3 major declarations. There was the Marrakesh Declaration, the Jakarta Declaration, and then one other one, I'm not remembering, but where they gather like large groups of Muslim intellectuals and religious leaders and so forth to, sign a statement saying, calling for protection of minorities or something very much like religious freedom. And, the more international that can be, the more you get respected religious leaders who are respected widely in the Muslim world and, not just the westernized ones, I think is important. But I think there is a long way to go. I mean, there are some Muslim intellectuals who are very powerful articulators of religious freedom. I think of Mustafa Akyol from Turkey. There's Abdullah Saeed from the Maldives. But both of them encounter big problems. I mean, Mustafa Akyol gave a lecture in Malaysia, and he was detained and put in jail for the night. Now, through some diplomatic action, they managed to get him out. And then Abdullah Saeed can't go back to his home in the Maldives. So, that indicates the kind of, that it's still an uphill struggle. But you can establish a kind of deposit of networks and intellectuals and make it transnational, make it rooted in the Muslim world, the more you can kind of, build an idea, I think. I mean, I think that maybe it's a different message in a way that needs to happen. In the secular repressive states, their view is we want to become modern and Western and developed, and that Islam is a break to that. But I think maybe the message is it doesn't have to be, that Islam is capable of, evolving in modern ways too, without and still being devoutly religious. I mean, the example of Turkey is very interesting. Let's leave aside today for a minute, but for most of Turkey's history, it was this secular repressive regime until about 2002. And interestingly, though, so you continually saw the development of Muslim parties who wanted it to be more open to Islam. But what would happen is periodically there would be a coup in which the secular regime, which had the military and the judiciary on its side, would throw them out. There would be a coup d'etat. Sometimes the leaders of the Muslim parties were hanged or killed or exiled or what have you. And then they would develop again. I mean, part of the problem is whenever they opened it to democracy, the Muslim parties would win because the population, the majority was not in favor of the kind of secular repressive approach. So whenever it's like a continual cycle in Turkish history, they open it up, the Muslim parties win, they have power for a little while, then there's a coup and they're thrown out, then gradually they open it up again, then there's a coup and they throw them out again. And this continually went on. But the interesting thing to observe is that in all this, the Muslim parties were actually more favorable to democracy. You developed a Muslim middle class associated with economic openness and trade and so forth. And they were also broadly favorable toward the NATO alliance in the West. Whereas the secular repressive regime was more socialistic. It was more, internal in its foreign policy. And I mean, the irony is that the Muslim party actually represented arguably a more promising avenue to modernity than the secular repressive regime, even though the message of the secular repressive regime is that religion has to be marginalized if we're going to get to modernity. So I think the message is that religion, there can also be a religious pathway towards things like economic development and opportunities for women and so forth and so on. Then, in 2002, you had the Justice and Development Party took over, the Muslim party, and it actually looked pretty good. It was trying to sort of open up more freedom and create a more kind of Muslim-friendly democracy. 2011, though, it became very authoritarian and not necessarily Islamist, but mainly just authoritarian under Erdogan, and I think that's where it is now. So you had a kind of brief experiment, so that would be my message there. I think the message in the religiously repressive regimes is that freedom does not have to be inimical to vibrant religion. And I think the example of West African countries shows that. They're highly devout, and yet it's also in an environment of freedom. And in fact, the very repressive Islamist approach may not be good for religion at all. I mean, there are surveys that were taken in secret in Saudi Arabia that shows that some 30% of the country is atheist. This is Saudi Arabia. So is it working? Is religious repression giving you what you want, this devout population? So, I think that's the kind of argument that you can give there. But again, that's assuming that you can make arguments in an oppressive regime, which is not always easy.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for coming. Yes. Thank you.